The sun beat down like a merciless drum over Dustwood's cracked earth, smearing long shadows across the parched main street. Heat shimmered off the rooftops, bending the world into a wavering dream, but nothing about today was a dream for Calamity Jane. She stood at the steps of the leaning town chapel, her white dress stained with dust, her hands shaking so hard the small lace gloves barely clung to her fingers. Boone Cutter stood beside her, broad and sun-scorched, a pistol pressed against her temple, his thumb cocking back the hammer with a lazy, practiced motion. His breath stank of whiskey and cruelty. "Go on, preacher," Boone growled, his voice low and oily. "Ain't got all day." The preacher, a thin, balding man whose collar hung limp with sweat, fumbled the Bible in his trembling hands. His gaze flickered across the gathered townsfolk, but no help came. They watched from shaded porches and behind windows, faces pinched with guilt and fear. Boone Cutter owned this town in ways no deed ever could. Calamity Jane swallowed hard, tasting bile. Her father had died coughing up blood in the spring, their farm swallowed by debts no banker wanted to forget. She had no brothers, no cousins close enough to care. Only Boone, ruthless, land-hungry Boone, had come knocking, not with offers but demands. The preacher cleared his throat, voice cracking. "Do you, Boone Cutter, take this woman?" A cold finger of dread crawled up Calamity Jane's spine. She couldn't hear the rest. The world narrowed to Boone's gloating smirk, the black mouth of the pistol barrel, the heavy silence of her neighbors doing nothing. Her heart pounded in her chest like a trapped bird. She thought of running, but Boone's men stood on the edge of the street, rifles slung easy across their backs, grinning like this was a fine afternoon's entertainment. Tears blurred her vision. She blinked them back fiercely. If she had to die, she wouldn't give Boone the satisfaction of seeing her weep. The preacher's voice wavered. "And do you, Calamity Jane, take this man?" Boone leaned close, his breath hot and sour on her cheek. "Say it, sweetheart," he whispered, the hammer of the gun cocking louder. "Or I'll say it for you." The sound of distant hoofbeats cracked the heavy air. Boone stiffened. So did his men. Heads turned down the long road stretching beyond town, a thin ribbon of dust rising where the horizon boiled. Calamity Jane dared a glance. Out of the heat shimmer came a rider, alone. A lean figure atop a pale dun horse, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Hat pulled low, a long coat flapping against lean legs. Whoever he was, he rode like he belonged to the land itself, worn into it, carved by it. Boone barked a laugh, loud and grating, breaking the stunned silence. "Well, look at that. We got us an audience." The townsfolk drifted back into doorways, anxious to be anywhere but between Boone and whoever had the gall to approach. The preacher stumbled backward, clutching his Bible to his chest like a shield. Boone turned Calamity Jane roughly to face the oncoming rider, the pistol now resting against the base of her skull. "Guess we'll have ourselves a proper wedding witness, huh, darlin'?" The rider drew closer, dust swirling around the horse's legs. He didn't raise his head. He didn't hurry. Just rode straight into the tension strung tighter than a noose across the street. When he finally reined in, not 20 paces from the church, he pushed his hat back with 2 fingers. His face came into view, sharp angles, rough beard, sun-leathered skin. His eyes were the thing that stuck, not fierce but cold, detached, like a man who'd seen every kind of dying and had grown tired of it. "Afternoon," he said, voice low and even. Boone spat into the dirt. "Ain't your business, stranger." The rider's gaze slid to Calamity Jane, lingering for the briefest moment. She stood stiff and shaking, her wrists gripped cruelly in Boone's meaty hand. The message was clear. Boone tightened his hold. "Move along." The rider tilted his head slightly, studying Boone like he might study a rattler coiled in the dust. "Seems to me," he said, voice carrying easily across the street, "you're fixin' to marry a gal who don't look none too willin' to." Boone's men chuckled, low, uneasy sounds. Boone bared his teeth in a snarl. "You got 2 choices, mister," Boone said, pressing the gun harder against Calamity Jane's head. "Get back on that nag of yours and ride out, or I plant you where you stand." The rider sighed like he was being asked to shovel someone else's manure. He swung a leg over and dropped to the ground, dust puffing around his boots. His hand hovered near his belt, but he didn't draw. Boone laughed again. "What, you think you're fast enough to take all of us?" The rider shrugged. "Don't have to be." Boone squinted, puzzled. The rider smiled faintly, not a warm smile, but the grim sort that said he'd already measured Boone's grave in his mind. "You ain't fast enough to shoot me and keep her alive," the rider said. For a moment, the street held its breath. Boone's face twisted. His eyes darted to Calamity Jane, then back to the stranger. his mind working slower than fear could travel. Calamity Jane felt it, the hesitation. A sharp wind picked up, tugging at her torn veil, sending it fluttering into the street like a ghost. Boone cursed under his breath and made his decision. The gun moved, swinging from Calamity Jane toward the rider. That was all it took. The rider's hand flashed, faster than thought, faster than breath. A single shot cracked through the air. Boone staggered, dropping his pistol, clutching his hand as blood welled bright between his fingers. Before Boone's men could react, the rider had Calamity Jane by the wrist, jerking her down the chapel steps. "Move," he barked, shoving her toward his horse. Shots rang out behind them, wild and panicked. Calamity Jane ducked instinctively, heart hammering against her ribs. The rider lifted her onto the saddle like she weighed no more than a sack of flour, swung up behind her, and kicked the horse hard into a gallop. They tore down the street, bullets whining past, townsfolk scattering like dry leaves. Behind them, Boone howled with rage, his wounded hand dripping red onto the dust. The town shrank away behind them, lost in a haze of gun smoke and cowardice. Calamity Jane clutched the saddle horn with both hands, the rider's arm firm around her waist, the world a blur of speed and fear and freedom. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't even know his name. But for the first time in months, she wasn't waiting for someone else to decide her fate. Ahead lay only open land, and the devil they'd left behind would surely come hunting. The rider bent low over the horse's neck, voice tight against her ear. "Hold on, girl," he said, "this ain't over yet." And somehow, despite the fear clawing at her insides, Calamity Jane smiled. Because neither was she. The horse ran hard, hooves tearing up the dry earth, and Calamity Jane held on with a grip that turned her knuckles white. Wind screamed in her ears, tugging her hair loose from its pins, stinging her eyes with dust and tears she didn't dare wipe away. Every heartbeat counted, every breath carried the bitter tang of fear. Behind them, the gunfire had fallen away, but Boone Cutter wouldn't give up so easy. He was the kind of man who'd chase a grudge clear to hell's doorstep if it meant keeping his pride intact. The rider slowed only when they reached a jagged ridge a few miles out, sheltering them in the broken teeth of the land. He swung down, scanned the horizon, then reached up and helped Calamity Jane dismount, his hands firm but careful, as if afraid she might break. Calamity Jane stumbled when her boots hit the ground, legs trembling from terror and the wild ride. The rider caught her elbow, steadying her, his face unreadable under the brim of his battered hat. "You hurt?" he asked, voice rough, stripped of anything but necessity. She shook her head, though every muscle in her body ached, and her ribs felt squeezed tight by panic. Words tangled in her throat. He had saved her. No one else in that whole miserable town had even tried. "Name's Elijah Kane," he said, still scanning the empty land. "Figure you ought to know who you're running with." "Calamity Jane," she managed, her voice no more than a whisper. "Calamity Jane." He nodded once. "Businesslike. No false comforts." A distant dust cloud rose on the horizon. "Riders?" "Boone's men." Calamity Jane saw Elijah's mouth tighten. He grabbed the reins, swung back into the saddle, and pulled her up behind him without asking. Her arms went around his waist instinctively. He was solid, all lean muscle and wiry strength, the kind of man built by hard trails and harder choices. "Hang on," he said. "Town ain't no safer than the trail, but we need to resupply." They rode hard for a small settlement wedged between two rocky bluffs, Rust Creek, no more than a scattering of buildings clinging to life like stubborn weeds. By the time they clattered into the main street, Calamity Jane was dizzy from heat and fear. Rust Creek looked no different than Dustwood, weather-beaten storefronts, a single watering trough, horses tied loose and half asleep under the midday sun. Men sat outside the saloon playing cards and pretending not to watch. Elijah swung down and helped her off. His eyes scanned the street, reading it like a man might read the first rumblings of a coming storm. "Keep close," he murmured. Calamity Jane nodded, clutching the folds of her torn dress. Inside the saloon, the air smelled of whiskey, sweat, and broken dreams. A piano in the corner had long since fallen silent. Rough men nursed drinks, their faces turning at the newcomers. Elijah pushed open the swinging doors, Calamity Jane tight at his side. Every pair of eyes followed them, calculating, weighing the odds. She could feel it, the way these men smelled trouble, the way wolves smelled blood. The barkeep, a broad-shouldered man with a walrus mustache, polished a glass that hadn't been clean in years. "What'll it be?" he asked, voice wary. "Whiskey." "Water," Elijah said. He dropped a silver coin on the bar. "And a room with a back door." The barkeep nodded slowly, eyes lingering on Calamity Jane's ripped dress and bruised wrists. His mouth pressed into a line, but he said nothing. Just slid the bottle and a glass down the bar, then jerked his head toward the stairwell. Calamity Jane sipped the water Elijah poured for her, her hands trembling so badly she spilled some. Elijah pretended not to notice. He watched the room instead, his fingers resting lightly on the revolver at his hip. "Town's full of cowards," Elijah said under his breath. "Don't count on 'em to lift a finger when trouble comes." Calamity Jane's throat tightened. It was the same everywhere. Men who would shake your hand in daylight but vanish come the first crack of gunfire. She set the glass down carefully. "You shouldn't have come for me." His gaze flicked to her, sharp and unexpected. Somebody had to. The words cut deep. She didn't know how to answer them. No one had chosen her side before. Not once. Elijah took a slow sip of whiskey, eyes still sweeping the saloon. "Boone's close. Feel it in my bones." "What do we do?" she asked. He gave a tight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Pray he's stupider than he looks." They climbed the rickety stairs to a small room overlooking the alley. A narrow bed, a cracked mirror, and a back door leading to the open hills beyond. Elijah bolted the front door and pulled the curtains tight. He checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder once, then tucking it back into his holster. Calamity Jane sank onto the bed, the mattress groaning under her weight. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to hold herself together. The room felt too small, too fragile to contain the fear clawing at her insides. Elijah crouched beside the door, his back against the wall, one knee bent. "Always ready. Always watching." "I can fight," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. He looked at her. Really looked this time. Not at her bruises or torn dress, but at the fire starting to kindle behind her tired eyes. "Ever shot a man?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. He didn't smile. Didn't mock her. Just said, "Hope you don't have to." The minutes dragged. Every creak of floorboard, every gust of wind outside the window made Calamity Jane jump. She hated it. Hated feeling like prey. Elijah sat like a rock, still and patient. She wondered what kind of life had carved that steadiness into him. What losses he carried hidden beneath the dust and leather. A noise downstairs, the heavy tread of boots. Voices raised in anger. Calamity Jane's heart jumped to her throat. Elijah rose in one smooth motion, gun drawn, his finger resting easy on the trigger. The barkeep's voice floated up through the floorboards, tight, forced. "Ain't seen nobody fitting that description." Another voice answered, Boone's oily with rage. "Lion's sack of..." The crash of breaking glass cut him off. Calamity Jane's breath caught. They'd come. Boone hadn't wasted time licking his wounds. He was here. He was hunting. Elijah jerked his head toward the back door. "Go." Calamity Jane didn't argue. She grabbed her skirts and slipped through, heart hammering so loud she could hardly hear her own footsteps. The alley was narrow, filled with trash and the sour stink of old beer. They moved fast, darting from shadow to shadow, slipping between leaning buildings. Shouts behind them. Boots pounding on the saloon floor. Boone's men spilling into the street like a pack of wild dogs. Elijah's hand found her wrist, tugging her along. They burst out into open land, the town falling away behind them. Sunlight blinded her, the heat like a wall. But Calamity Jane didn't stop. Didn't stumble. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, collapsing behind a fallen boulder out in the scrublands. Elijah knelt beside her, scanning the rise behind them. "They'll track us," he said grimly. "Ain't no place to hide out here." Calamity Jane wiped sweat from her brow, breathing hard. "Then what?" He looked at her, a flicker of something fierce and proud sparking in his eyes. "Then we stop running." The words sank deep. A choice. Not to be hunted. Not to be helpless. To stand. For the first time since Boone Cutter had barged into her life, Calamity Jane felt a glimmer of something sharp and stubborn stirring in her chest. She looked out across the endless wild, the broken land stretching to the horizon, and nodded. "All right," she said. "Let's make our stand." The desert wind carried their words away, but the promise in them stayed, stronger than steel. Behind them, the town of cowards faded into dust. Ahead, the real battle waited. And this time, Calamity Jane wasn't going to face it on her knees. The afternoon sun scorched the landscape to the color of old bones. Calamity Jane and Elijah moved. Through it like ghosts, slipping from rocky outcrops to shallow gullies, always with one eye on the horizon. The land stretched wide and cruel around them. No shelter, no mercy. Only the constant knowledge that behind them Boone Cutter was coming. Each step ground sand into Calamity Jane's blistered feet. Her dress snagged on thorn bushes, her throat burned from thirst, but she didn't complain. Couldn't. There was no room left for weakness. Only survival. Elijah paused at the crest of a narrow ridge, scanning the wasteland below. His hand rested on his revolver without thought, as natural as breathing. He wasn't a talker, Calamity Jane had learned. He listened to the land, to the air itself, catching whispers she couldn't hear. A thin trail of dust rose miles behind them. "They're gaining," he muttered, eyes narrowing against the sun. Calamity Jane squinted. She could just make out the faint shapes of riders moving like ants across the desert floor. "How many?" she asked, voice dry as the dust under her boots. "5. Maybe 6. Her stomach twisted. Boone wouldn't rest until he had her under his boot again, and Elijah dead in the dirt. She touched the small pistol he had given her that morning, tucked awkwardly into the waistband of her dress. It felt alien, heavy, but oddly reassuring. She wasn't defenseless anymore. Elijah turned to her. "We can't outrun him. Horses near spent and we're on foot now." Calamity Jane straightened her shoulders, swallowing her fear. "Then we fight." A shadow of a smile flickered across Elijah's face, brief but real. "Got grit," he said quietly, almost to himself. They moved into the narrow canyons where the land twisted and rose, creating natural choke points. Elijah's sharp eyes picked a spot, a dead-end hollow ringed by steep rock walls. Nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. Perfect if you were crazy enough to make a stand. He crouched, sketching quick lines in the dirt with a stick. "When they ride in, they'll bottleneck here. We'll pick him off before they fan out." Calamity Jane knelt beside him, watching. Learning. "You stay low behind that rock," Elijah instructed, pointing. "If one of them gets close, you shoot. Aim for center mass. Don't hesitate." Her hands shook a little as she nodded. She hated the idea of killing, but she hated Boone's laughter in her nightmares more. The minutes crawled by. The land held its breath. Even the cicadas fell silent. Calamity Jane crouched in the dirt, pistol ready, heart pounding so loud she was sure it would give them away. Then came the riders. Their hooves clattered against stone, echoing like gunshots. Boone's harsh voice barked orders, and his men, half drunk on anger and dust, thundered into the narrow canyon. The first shot cracked like lightning. One of Boone's men pitched backward off his horse, hitting the ground in a dead sprawl. The canyon erupted in chaos. Elijah moved like something carved from pure violence, firing, reloading, ducking behind boulders. Calamity Jane pressed her back against the rock, breath held tight in her lungs. A shadow loomed. One of Boone's men broke from the others, charging toward her with a wild yell. Calamity Jane raised the pistol, hands trembling. He was so close she could see the sweat dripping down his temple, the mad gleam in his eye. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands, the shot deafening in the narrow space. The man jerked sideways, crumpling with a grunt. His rifle clattered from his hands and slid into the dust. Calamity Jane gasped, heart hammering. She had done it. She had saved herself. No time to think. More gunfire crackled around them. Boone roared from somewhere deeper in the canyon, fury twisting his voice into something inhuman. "Kill him both," he bellowed. "Make him suffer." Another rider fell under Elijah's merciless aim. Another turned tail, spurring his horse hard, dust trailing behind him like a comet. The fight tightened into brutal, dirty skirmishes, fists against flesh, blades flashing in the sun. Calamity Jane ducked low, crawling toward Elijah when she saw him stumble. Blood soaked the sleeve of his coat, crimson blooming like a deadly flower. "You're hit," she cried, reaching for him. "Just a scratch," he grunted, shoving a fresh cartridge into his revolver with grim efficiency. "Ain't dead yet." Calamity Jane grabbed the dropped rifle from the man she had shot. It was heavy, unfamiliar, but she found the trigger, found the weight of it in her arms. Another of Boone's men rounded a boulder, eyes wild, gun swinging up. Calamity Jane didn't think. She fired. The man crumpled before he could pull his trigger, falling hard onto the stones. Silence fell. Calamity Jane's breath rasped in her throat. Elijah crouched beside her, blood dripping from his sleeve, dust clinging to every inch of him. "That all of him?" she whispered. He nodded once. "All but Boone." A chill slid down her spine. She knew deep in her bones Boone wouldn't die easy. As if summoned by the thought, Boone's voice echoed down the canyon. "You think you can hide behind rocks forever?" he sneered. "You think that fancy shot of yours means a damn thing?" Elijah helped Calamity Jane to her feet. His hand, rough and warm, lingered on her shoulder. "This ends today," he said. She nodded. No more running. No more cowering. They stepped out into the open, the canyon walls rising like silent witnesses around them. Boone sat atop his horse, his hand wrapped in a bloodied bandage from where Elijah had shot him before. His face twisted into something feral when he saw them. Well, he sneered. A little farm girl and a half-dead drifter. Thought you could outsmart me? He dismounted, tossing the reins aside. His pistol gleamed in the harsh light. You ain't walking away from this, he promised, voice thick with hate. Calamity Jane gripped her rifle tighter, planting her feet. Elijah raised his revolver, steady despite the blood soaking through his shirt. Boone stalked forward, slow and deliberate. Drop the gun, girl, he barked. Ain't no shame in knowing your place. Calamity Jane lifted her chin. Her voice, when it came, was clear and unshaking. My place ain't at your feet. Boone's face turned red with rage. He lunged forward, raising his pistol. The crack of a shot split the air. Boone staggered, staring down at the dark hole blooming in his chest. He turned bewildered eyes toward Calamity Jane. She held the rifle steady, smoke curling from the barrel. Boone fell to his knees, then to his face, the dust swallowing him whole. The canyon held its breath. Calamity Jane stood over him, heart hammering, the rifle still clutched in both hands. Elijah lowered his revolver slowly. His face was a mix of pain, pride, and something else she couldn't quite name. It was over. Or at least this part was. Calamity Jane dropped the rifle into the dust, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline ebbed. She felt Elijah's hand on her shoulder again, grounding her, steadying her. You done good, Calamity Jane, he said quietly. She looked at him, really looked, saw the man who had stood between her and a fate worse than death, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back. We ain't done yet, she said. Elijah gave a slow nod, respect shining in his weary gaze. Together, they turned toward the open land beyond the canyon. No town. No safe harbor. Just a long, hard trail stretching into the unknown. But for the first time in her life, Calamity Jane wasn't afraid of it. Because now she knew she could fight. She could stand. She could survive. The devil had chased them across the dust and stone, but they had stood their ground. And they were still standing. The sun dipped low, setting the world ablaze in gold and fire. The canyon lay silent behind them, a graveyard for the men who had thought blood and cruelty could carve the world to their liking. Ahead, the open land stretched endless and raw, daring them forward. Elijah leaned heavy in the saddle, blood soaking through his makeshift bandage. Calamity Jane rode close beside him, the weight of the last hours pressing against her shoulders, but not breaking them. Somewhere along that bloody trail, she had shed the last tattered remnants of the girl who had stood trembling at a preacher's altar with a gun pressed to her head. Now she was something harder. Something stronger. They rode until the stars bled out across the sky and the land grew cold. A lone cottonwood tree stood crooked against the horizon, its black silhouette a finger clawing at the heavens. Elijah pulled up there, swaying slightly in the saddle before sliding down. Calamity Jane jumped down too, catching his arm as he staggered. You need rest, she said, voice firm. Don't got time, he muttered, grimacing. You'll bleed out if you don't, she snapped back. He gave a faint, crooked smile, an acknowledgement, an apology, maybe even a hint of admiration. Then he let her guide him to sit against the rough bark. The night pressed close, full of rustling grass and distant coyote calls. Calamity Jane lit a small fire, shielding it with stones so the glow wouldn't give them away. Elijah's face looked carved from stone, the firelight catching the hollows of his cheeks, the dark smudges under his eyes. He watched her work with a weariness that went deeper than the wound in his arm. She tore a strip from what remained of her dress and cleaned the blood away, hands steady now. You're good at patching up, he rasped. Had to be, she said quietly. When Pa got sick, I was the only one left to tend him. The fire cracked, throwing up sparks into the vast, indifferent sky. Elijah's eyes closed briefly. Then he said, was a girl once. Bright. Full of spit and vinegar. Name was Annie. She waited for me to come home from the war. Calamity Jane's hands froze. When I finally did, Elijah continued, voice rough, Boone had already found her. Took what he wanted. Left her with nothing but shame. He opened his eyes, and they were hollower than any wound could make them. She put a bullet in her heart before I could set it right. Calamity Jane said nothing. There were no words big enough to stitch that kind of wound. You remind me of her, Elijah said, voice low. But you're stronger. You didn't wait to be saved. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent promise that his ghosts were not alone tonight. In the distance, a new sound broke the night, the faint thunder of hooves. Calamity Jane rose to her feet, heart thudding. "They're still coming," she said. Elijah forced himself upright, biting back a grunt of pain. He buckled on his belt, checked his revolver. Only 3 bullets left. Calamity Jane checked the rifle she'd taken. 2 shots. Would have to be enough. They moved to the edge of the little hollow, crouching low. The stars threw down enough silver light to see shapes moving through the grass. 2 riders, maybe 3, moving slow, careful. Boone's leftovers. The last of the pack. Calamity Jane looked at Elijah. His face was hard, unreadable. "Stay low," he said. "Pick your shots." The first rider edged closer, the gleam of a rifle barrel catching the starlight. Calamity Jane aimed, heart pounding in her ears, every sense sharpened to a razor's edge. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared and the rider toppled like a broken doll. Chaos exploded. Gunfire cracked the night open. Calamity Jane dropped flat as bullets tore up the dirt around her. Elijah fired once, twice. Clean, measured shots. Another rider screamed and fell. 1 left. The last man charged straight at them, crazed by fear and fury, gun blazing. Calamity Jane scrambled backward, fumbling for another round. Elijah stepped forward into the open, calm as sunrise. The final shot from his revolver dropped the last man in a heap at his horse's feet. Silence slammed down again. Calamity Jane crawled to Elijah's side, heart in her throat. "You hit." He shook his head, though he sagged a little more with every breath. "It's over," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "No," Elijah said softly, staring out into the empty land. "Not until you decide." Calamity Jane frowned, not understanding. "You got a choice now, Calamity Jane," he said. "You can ride back to Dustwood. Let him pat you on the head. Marry some man who'll think he's doing you a kindness." She shook her head fiercely. "Or," Elijah said, his voice dipping lower, "you can keep riding. Make your own way. Live by your own hand." He looked at her then, really looked, and in his eyes was not pity, not protection, but respect. "No one gets to choose for you anymore," he said. "Not Boone. Not me." Calamity Jane felt something crack open in her chest. A final, shattering goodbye to the girl who had once waited for a savior. She stood slowly, the night wind pulling her hair loose around her shoulders. "I ain't going back," she said. Elijah's smile was weary but genuine. "Figured you'd say that." He pushed to his feet with a grunt, wobbling a little. Calamity Jane slid under his arm without a word, steadying him. Together they saddled the tired horse. Together they turned their backs on the graveyard behind them. They rode slow at first, the stars wheeling overhead, the land whispering promises of hardship and hope in equal measure. At the top of a low ridge, Calamity Jane pulled the horse to a stop and looked back. Dustwood was a smudge on the horizon. Boone Cutter was just another story to scare children by firelight. Fear was still out there, still waiting, but so was freedom. Beside her, Elijah tipped his hat low against the night. "Where to, Miss Dalton?" She grinned, the first real grin she'd felt in years. "Anywhere but back." He chuckled, a dry, cracked sound but real. "Good answer." They nudged the horse forward, the world opening up in front of them, vast and merciless and full of fierce, stubborn life. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled and Calamity Jane laughed, sharp and wild and free. The world was still dangerous. But now she was too. And she reckoned that was fair enough. The wind rolled like a restless spirit through Dead Horse Ridge, pushing dust in angry spirals across the wooden planks of the station platform. Dora Dufresne May stood alone, the hem of her faded blue traveling dress clinging to her ankles, a valise gripped tight in one gloved hand. The train had long since shrieked its way into the distance, leaving only silence, a few mocking crows on the wire, and a woman who'd bet everything on a man who hadn't come. She glanced again at the telegram tucked in her bodice, its creases soft from worry and rereading. Charles R. Hanley. Dead Horse Ridge. April 4th. Noon train. Will meet you. A promise written in black ink and false hope. It was now near 3. She'd arrived at noon, heart fluttering like a bird in a cage. She stood for the first hour. Sat for the second. Now her legs ached and her pride burned. Still she waited. "Miss? You all right?" The voice startled her. She turned, stiff and slow, to find a man standing just past the loading crates. Tall, weather-worn, the color of prairie dirt in long sun. His hat cast shadow over eyes that didn't smile, though his voice tried. He looked like he belonged to the land, broad shoulders, hands like shovel blades, a coat that had seen more winters than she had suitors. I'm fine, she said too quickly. Then, softer with a hint of learned patience, I'm just waiting on someone. The man nodded once, slowly. He didn't press. Elias Boone, he said after a pause. I come through town once a week. Mail run supplies. He gestured at the wagon hitched behind him. A tired-looking mule flicked its ear in greeting. You sure he's still coming? Dora Dufresne inhaled sharply and looked away. I received a letter. He said he'd be here. Elias looked at her for a moment, like a man evaluating a wounded animal, deciding whether to approach or walk away. Stationmaster says you got in on the noon train. That was near 3 hours ago. Dora Dufresne forced a smile, brittle and breaking. Perhaps he's just delayed. Maybe. The silence between them stretched. She hated the way her dignity felt paper-thin beneath his gaze, but it wasn't unkind. There was something different in him, an understanding that needed no explanation. I can wait longer, she said, folding her hands tightly in her lap. It's no trouble. He nodded again as if it wasn't his place to contradict her. He turned to leave, hesitated, then offered, there's a bench under shade just around back. Wind won't reach you there. She didn't move. Pride was a cruel companion. But pride hadn't kept her safe all these years. Pride hadn't stopped her brother from controlling every step she took. Pride hadn't written her letters when the nights grew too quiet and the dreams too loud. When Elias Boone returned half an hour later, she was still there, still alone, but no longer sitting upright. Her chin had drifted downward, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Her grip on the valise had slackened. He cleared his throat gently. She startled. Didn't mean to wake you. It's fine, she said, rising too quickly, catching her balance. I was just resting my eyes. The way I see it, Elias began, a woman left at a station's got two choices. Stay and hope for a ghost or leave and find something solid. She looked at him then, not through him, not away from him, but at him. His face was solemn, yes, but steady. He hadn't come to rescue her, she could see that. But he wasn't walking away either. My place isn't far. Half-day's ride. You're welcome to come until you sort things. The offer hung awkwardly in the air, neither tender nor transactional. She knew what it would sound like to others. A man brings home a stranger and people talk. But she also knew what it was to sleep outside a depot in a town where she knew no one. I won't be a burden, she said. If you've got chores I can help. I'm not afraid of work. He gave the smallest nod, as though her dignity mattered to him, as though she hadn't just admitted she had no place to go. You ride. Not in a long while, she admitted. We'll go slow. The road out of town was rutted and wild. Dora Dufresne sat stiffly on the wagon bench beside Elias, the wind loosening strands of hair from her pinned bun. The sun slid toward the horizon, drawing shadows long across the plains. Neither spoke for a while. It was Elias who broke the quiet. So what do you know of Charles Hanley? She hesitated, then said, we exchanged letters for nearly a year. He said he was a rancher. Widower. Said he wanted a woman with sense and steadiness, not some fluttering girl. Her voice faltered. I suppose I was fool enough to believe him. You weren't, Elias said without looking at her. You just wanted out. She blinked, surprised by how easily he'd struck the truth. And surprised, too, by the relief that came with being seen so clearly. They reached the ranch as dusk fell. The land spread out in all directions, hills like crouched beasts, a narrow creek shimmering under the moonlight. A barn, a small corral, a low house with a front porch that sagged in the middle. It wasn't much. But it was quiet. It was clean. Elias helped her down from the wagon without ceremony. You can have the spare room. Sheets are clean mostly. Water pumps around back. He said nothing more, simply led the mule toward the barn, leaving her to find her way inside. The house was plain, wooden-floored and time-worn. A single photograph sat on the mantel, Elias with a younger woman. Her expression was soft, serious, her hand resting on his shoulder like she'd steadied him all his life. Dora Dufresne looked away. In the days that followed, Dora Dufresne found work. Not from obligation, Elias hadn't asked, but from the need to be useful. She cooked, washed, learned the ways of the animals. She was up before dawn, hands raw from scrubbing, but she was moving. And that was better than thinking. Elias spoke little, but when he did, his words mattered. He noticed things, the way she favored her left leg when tired, how she hummed while kneading bread, how she flinched at sudden noises. He didn't ask about her past, not yet, but he listened when she offered slivers of it, which came in moments, quiet ones between fence posts or firelight. He told her once, in that quiet way of his, that his wife had died of pneumonia 5 winters back. Got caught in a storm driving cattle. She told me not to go out. I didn't listen. By the time I got back, she was already coughing. There was no self-pity in his voice, just a worn ache that lived deep under his skin. You blame yourself, Dora Dufresne said. He didn't answer, but the silence spoke. One morning she found a letter in the mailbox addressed to her. The envelope was dirty, the handwriting angry and familiar. Her hands trembled. You all right? Elias asked from behind her. She nodded, then shook her head. It's my brother. He waited. He must have found out where I went. He's coming. Elias's jaw tightened. You want me to send word back? She looked up at him, vulnerability flickering across her face like the shadow of a candle. He doesn't take no kindly. He studied her a long moment. You're not alone anymore, Dora Dufresne. The words landed softly, like snow on an old scar. Not romantic, not a promise, but something truer. That night, she stood on the porch as the stars spilled across the sky, and for the first time in a long time she felt still. Elias joined her, standing beside her without speaking. They watched the land breathe in darkness. You think he'll really come? He asked. She nodded. If he thinks he's lost control of me, he'll come. Elias's gaze drifted to the barn. He didn't speak, but she knew. He was already thinking of what must be done. The night wind rose, cooler now. Dora Dufresne pulled her shawl tighter. Elias took a step forward, then stopped. Don't know much about fate, he said. But sometimes folks meet at the wrong place for the right reason. She didn't reply, but she didn't look away. Inside, the lantern burned low. Outside, the prairie slept. And in the quiet, something began, not loud, not clear, but steady. Like the first note of a song that might just change everything. The sun was barely above the horizon when Elias rapped lightly on Dora Dufresne's doorframe. He didn't call out, never did, but she sensed him there before she turned. The smell of dawn was on him, leather and hay and cold creek water. She tied her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out, blinking into the pale gold light that softened the hard edges of the land. Town day, he said, already moving toward the corral. Dora Dufresne nodded. She'd been expecting it. Supplies were low, and she'd overheard him muttering about sugar and salt running out. What she hadn't expected was that he'd hitch up 2 horses, not one, and toss her a pair of worn gloves. I'll ride, she said slowly. Not sit the wagon? He gave a short shrug, neither invitation nor command. You said you weren't afraid of work. She caught the corner of a smile hiding beneath his beard and bit back her own. The horse was calm under her, older, well-trained. Her back protested at first, but it was better than sitting like a sack of potatoes while he handled everything. And riding next to him, really riding, felt like claiming something of her own. The trail into Dead Horse Ridge wound through scrubland and over a narrow pass, the kind that whispered of ambushes and outlaws in the stories she used to read. The sky widened as they rode, and Dora Dufresne, for the first time since stepping off that train, felt the weight of her past loosen just slightly. He didn't speak for a long while. Elias Boone rarely filled silence just to fill it. But when he did talk, it carried weight. You always carry yourself so still, he said without looking at her. Like you're listening for something coming up behind you. I suppose I am, she replied, eyes ahead. They said no more until the town came into view, dust lifting off the roofs like smoke. Children ran barefoot in the street, a dog barked somewhere near the smithy, and a bell clanged behind the general store. It should have felt quaint. To Dora Dufresne, it felt like walking into a room full of eyes. She dismounted slowly, feeling the familiar creep of judgment settle in around her. She caught sight of a woman in a bonnet whispering behind her gloved hand. 2 men leaned against the saloon, nodding toward Elias with unreadable expressions. Word had spread then. The quiet widower had brought home a woman. One who arrived without a man to claim her. Elias ignored it all. He tied the horses and handed her a list scrawled in blocky handwriting. If you take the dry goods, I'll see to the hardware. Dora Dufresne took it with a nod, grateful for the excuse to move, to blend. She went inside the general store and breathed in the scent of flour sacks and molasses. Mrs. Dobbins, the storekeeper's wife, greeted her with tight politeness. Dora Dufresne returned it in kind, lifting her chin and speaking clearly, as if she hadn't arrived under a cloud of speculation. Sugar, salt, coffee beans, soap, and, she hesitated, peppermints if you've any. Mrs. Dobbins narrowed her eyes slightly but said nothing. When Dora Dufresne laid the coins down, her fingers shook. She hated that. She hated how small she still felt. Outside, Elias waited by the wagon, arms folded. He didn't comment on the whispers or the stares. He never did. They loaded the supplies in silence, but it wasn't a cold silence. It was shared, like two people carrying the same weight without needing to speak its name. They were halfway out of town when Dora Dufran said, "Why did you bring me?" He didn't look at her. "You needed out of the house." "Because I was brooding?" "Because you were hiding." She flushed but didn't argue. He was right. "I spent most of my life in a house I wasn't allowed to leave," she said. "It gets easier to stay still than move." Elias didn't offer comfort. Just the truth. Stillness can bury you if you're not careful. They were quiet again as the trail curved near the creek. A hawk circled above them, its cry sharp and distant. Dora Dufran said, "When your wife died, did you stop moving?" He nodded once. "Thought I'd let the land do my living for me. Turned out it didn't." The sun reached its peak, baking the dust into their clothes. They stopped at the ridge for a drink and a bite, dried meat, biscuits from the morning's bake. Dora Dufran pulled out the peppermint she'd hidden from Mrs. Dobbin's list and handed him one without a word. He took it, unwrapping it slowly. "You always bribe people with candy?" "Only when they look like they've forgotten what sweet tastes like." He didn't laugh, not exactly. But a sound rumbled low in his throat, something close enough. She smiled without meaning to. They were nearly home when Elias slowed his horse, eyes narrowing. Tracks, fresh, shallow in the dust. Not his, not hers. Recent. Dora Dufran followed his gaze. "Someone's been near?" He nodded. "Boots. Not riding. Walking heavy." Her heart started to hammer. "You think it's my brother?" "Could be," Elias said. "Could also be nothing." But they both knew it wasn't nothing. She looked around, suddenly aware of how open the land was, how little cover they had. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch with a lantern beside her, fingers curled around a cup of tea gone cold. The sound of crickets filled the air, but underneath it she imagined footsteps. Imagined the weight of hands grabbing her again. The voice that had controlled her for decades, telling her what to wear, who to speak to, how to breathe. She didn't hear Elias until he stepped out of the shadows, quiet as ever, a shotgun slung over one shoulder. "You shouldn't be alone out here," he said. "I'm not," she answered and meant it. He sat beside her. Neither said anything for a long while. "My brother," she began. "He used to say I was too soft for the world. That no man would ever want a woman who'd already grown old with no husband." Elias turned his head slightly. "He's wrong." She laughed once, bitter. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said. "You work hard. You speak plain. And you haven't flinched once since you got here, even though you had reason." She looked at him. "And you? What did your wife say about you?" "She said I was better at fixing fences than people. Said I never spoke when I should have and always spoke when I shouldn't." "She sounds wise." She was. A silence fell again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The kind of silence that settles between people who have started to trust each other. Suddenly, a noise cut through the quiet, a rustle beyond the barn, too heavy for wind. Elias stood, movement smooth and instinctual. He moved off the porch, shotgun raised, eyes scanning. Dora Dufran stayed back, pulse thudding. Then a figure stumbled into the light. A man, wounded, bleeding from the shoulder, ragged coat trailing dust. He collapsed at Elias's feet with a groan. "Hell?" Elias muttered. "Outlaw most like." "Is he dead?" Dora Dufran asked, rushing forward despite herself. "Not yet." She knelt beside the man, pressing her hand to the wound. Blood welled through her fingers. "We have to help him." Elias looked at her hard. "He might have brought trouble with him. Then help me fast before it finds us." They dragged the man inside. Dora Dufran cleaned the wound with boiling water while Elias stitched it, hands steady even under pressure. The outlaw didn't wake that night, but he breathed. Later, Elias leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "You didn't hesitate. I taught school in a mining town. You learned to patch up busted boys quick." "I wasn't talking about your hands." Dora Dufran didn't reply. She simply rinsed the blood from her apron and hung it by the fire. Outside, the wind picked up. Something was coming. They could both feel it now, closer than ever. Trouble had a way of finding you when you thought you just started to outrun it. But Dora Dufran no longer felt like a woman running. She felt for the first time like a woman standing. Not alone. And not soft. When she finally lay down, sleep came slowly. Her last thought was not of fear, but of Elias Boone's words, "Stillness can bury you." And Dora Dufran may had no intention of being buried. The outlaw woke screaming. It was a guttural, wordless sound that tore through the early morning calm, jolting Dora Dufran from sleep. She ran barefoot from her room, heart thudding against her ribs, and found Elias already crouched beside the stranger's cot, a steadying hand on the man's chest. The outlaw's eyes darted wildly, sweat slicking his brow as he thrashed against the makeshift bandage Dora Dufran had tied around his shoulder. "Easy," Elias muttered. "You're safe." The man blinked through the haze, pain sharpening his voice into gravel. "Ain't no such thing as safe." Dora Dufran stepped closer, clutching the folded towel she'd grabbed on instinct. "You remember your name?" The outlaw coughed, then grimaced. "Call me Ren. Least that's what the wanted posters say." "You're wanted?" He nodded and winced. "Used to ride with a man named Jacob Fairlow. Bounty hunter now, but back then he was meaner than any outlaw I knew. He don't forget folks who leave him behind." Dora Dufran felt the air drain from the room. "Jacob Fairlow is my brother." Ren's eyes flicked to her, and something changed in his face. Not recognition, but wariness, the kind of instinct that kept men like him alive longer than they deserved. "Then you ought to run. That man's not just comin'. He's huntin'. And he ain't comin' for talk." Elias stood, the tension in his shoulders like a coiled rope ready to snap. "How far behind?" Ren coughed again, then said, "Saw him 2 days ago. Was trailin' west with 2 others. Likely think I'm dead. But he'll sniff your scent soon enough." Dora Dufran didn't speak. Her fingers tightened around the towel until the edge cut into her palm. Elias looked at her, and there was no pretense in his face now, only warning. "You have to decide now," he said. "Do we run or do we stay and fight?" "I ran my whole life," she said. "I'm tired." Ren groaned, trying to sit up. "Then you best be ready. He won't wait till morning to make a point." The day passed like a slow-turning wheel. Dora Dufran went through the motions, changing Ren's dressing, boiling water, chopping wood, but every sound made her heart stumble. She caught herself looking at the windows too often, checking shadows, counting clouds. Elias said little, but he checked the rifles, cleaned the pistols, and sharpened the hatchet. He moved like a man preparing not just for danger but for death. As dusk began to melt into night, Dora Dufran stood by the barn and watched the horizon. The sky burned orange, clouds heavy with stormlight. The land stretched quiet and too still. Then a flicker, barely visible, something glinting on the ridge, far off but moving. "Riders. 3. She turned and ran for the house. "They're here." Elias didn't flinch. "Then we don't have long." He handed her the shotgun. Her hands trembled only once. "I've never shot a man," she said. "Good. That means you'll aim true if you have to." Ren struggled to his feet, limping toward the back door. "I'll cover the barn. Might not stand long, but I'll take one with me." Dora Dufran wanted to argue, to insist he rest, but there wasn't time. She nodded instead. "Thank you." The air grew thick, electric. The first raindrops began to fall just as the hoofbeats reached the edge of the clearing. They didn't dismount. 3 riders, faces obscured by dust and dusk, stopped just past the fence line. The lead man tilted his head as if admiring the scenery. Then he called out, "Dora Dufran May. Come out, darlin'. No need for dramatics." She stepped onto the porch, shotgun at her side. Elias stood beside her, rifle cradled but ready. "You can ride back the way you came, Jacob," she called. "You've no claim here." He laughed low and dry. "No claim? That's rich. I fed you, clothed you, protected you. You caged me. That cage was a roof. You've always needed someone to think for you." Elias stepped forward. "She thinks fine on her own." Fairlow shifted in his saddle. "You the widower? Thought you'd be uglier. Thought you'd be older." Elias raised the rifle a few inches. "And I thought bounty hunters had better sense than to pick a fight with a man defending his home." The man to Fairlow's right suddenly spurred his horse forward, drawing a pistol. Elias fired once. The rider fell hard, the impact echoing through the storm-heavy air. The horse bolted. Dora Dufran flinched but didn't scream. Her fingers tightened on the shotgun's grip. Fairlow didn't look surprised. "That's how it is then?" Elias said nothing. Ren fired from the barn window, catching the second man in the leg. The rider howled and fell sideways, dragging his mount to the ground with him. Fairlow dismounted slowly, calmly. Dora Dufran could see it now, his face older but not softened. The same cold eyes. The same cruel mouth. "I came to bring her home," he said, stepping forward. "You want to be a hero? Fine. Just know how this ends." Dora Dufran raised the shotgun. "I'm not going back. You don't get to choose." "I just did." She pulled the trigger. The blast knocked her back, not from the recoil but the finality of it. The shot hit Fairlow in the shoulder. He staggered, stunned, then stumbled behind the rain barrel. Elias fired again, pinning him down. Then silence. Rain poured now, flattening the dust, washing blood into the earth. Dora Dufresne stood, breath heaving, eyes wide. She waited for another shot, another shout. None came. Only the sound of water and the moan of a wounded man. Elias stepped down, rifle still ready. He moved around the porch slowly, then returned. His shirt was wet through, hair slicked to his temples. His voice was calm but soft. He's alive. Barely. We can turn him in. She sat down hard on the porch steps. Her knees had gone soft. He won't stop, she said. No, Elias agreed. But we just started. They buried the second rider near the edge of the fence line. Ren refused to sleep indoors, choosing instead to rest near the barn with a rifle across his lap. Dora Dufresne didn't protest. He'd earned his place. That night, Elias brought her a blanket and sat beside her in front of the fire. His hands were still stained, but his voice had smoothed. You were brave. I was terrified. You still pulled the trigger. She looked at him. You're not afraid? I'm always afraid, he said. I've just learned not to let it stop my hands. Lightning flashed beyond the windows, followed by a low rumble. The storm hadn't ended, it was only shifting. I don't know what comes next, Dora Dufresne said. Elias didn't answer right away. Then he said, that's the best part. She leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting to the ceiling. For the first time in her life, she'd chosen to fight for herself. And someone had fought beside her, not out of obligation or control, but choice. Outside, the land breathed again. The storm had passed, but the sky still held its power, like something ancient watching them both. Dora Dufresne didn't know what morning would bring. But she knew this, she was done hiding. And so was he. Spring crept over Dead Horse Ridge with a kind of shy tenderness, the way a tired soul tiptoes into peace after a long war. The land changed quietly. Where once the wind dragged dust like a whip, now wildflowers peeked through softening soil. The hills were green again, and the creek sang brighter than before. Dora Dufresne May stood barefoot in the garden behind the ranch house, a trowel in one hand and a sprig of sage in the other. Her dress was dirt-streaked, her hair pinned loosely, and her hands bore the strength of someone who had built something from nothing. The soil beneath her nails didn't bother her. It made her feel tethered. Across the field, Elias Boone was hammering fence posts, sleeves rolled high, his sun-worn skin darkened even further by the new season. He moved with quiet purpose, a man no longer drifting. He caught her eye once, from across the space between them, and that look alone said more than words would have dared. The ranch had survived the storm, in every sense. Fairlow had been turned into the marshal 3 weeks prior, alive but broken, both in body and power. Ren had ridden out east 2 days after, healed enough to limp but not to linger. He'd left behind a knife carved from antler and a quiet thank you neither Dora Dufresne nor Elias would forget. Dora Dufresne took to teaching the town children 3 afternoons a week, reading lessons beneath a poplar tree near the church while Elias waited quietly in the wagon, pretending not to listen. She told the Reverend she wasn't a wife, not yet, but no one pressed. In a town like Dead Horse Ridge, survival rewrote propriety. The townsfolk who once whispered behind gloved hands now nodded in greeting. Mrs. Dobbins sent her extra sugar in brown paper sacks. The smithy sharpened her gardening tools without charge. And the boy from the telegraph office offered to run errands with the eager hope of a pup finding new purpose. One late morning, as Dora Dufresne returned from the creek with a basket of wild mint, she saw Elias by the corral, staring toward the ridge. His back was to her, motionless. The sky was cloudless, the light too gentle for trouble. She stepped closer. You look like a man expecting ghosts. He didn't startle. Just thinking. Dangerous habit. He smiled just a twitch. Was thinking how quiet it is. And? Used to feel like silence was a punishment. Now it just feels earned. She placed the basket on the fence rail and looked out across the land with him. You still write in that old book of yours? He nodded. Sometimes. What do you write? Things I didn't say when I should have. She tilted her head. Say one now. He hesitated only a second. You were the first thing I didn't regret in a long, long while. Dora Dufresne's breath caught, not because of the words themselves but because of the man who said them. She'd known Elias Boone to be steady, guarded, gruff. This was the same man and yet not. You ever think about what's next? She asked softly. Every damn day. The next morning he asked her to ride with him. He didn't say where and she didn't press. They took the wagon, not the horses, and traveled the road that wound back toward the town. The breeze was warm, playful, and the trees whispered like old women sharing secrets. When the train station came into view, Dora Dufran stilled. Elias reined the mule and climbed down. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in flannel. His fingers worked clumsily, unfolding it to reveal a ring, simple, silver, worn but polished. "I found this in the drawer with her things," he said. "She never wore it much. Said it scratched when she worked." Dora Dufran's heart began to hammer. "I asked her once what to do with it if anything happened. She told me, don't let it rust. Give it to someone who'll make it shine again." He stepped closer. "I ain't good at speeches. I don't believe in grand gestures. But I know what it is to lose, and now I know what it is to want something again." She looked at him, eyes full. "So I brought you back to where I found you," he said. "Not to return you, but to ask if you'd stay, proper this time." Her laugh came out as a sob. She nodded, because words were useless when a life was changing before your eyes. He slipped the ring on her finger. It was imperfect. It was beautiful. The ride back felt shorter, lighter. Like the wagon knew it was hauling more than supplies now, it was hauling hope. That night, they stood outside as the sky turned lavender and the first stars blinked into being. Elias had lit the porch lantern, though the light from the house already spilled warm across the yard. Dora Dufran held his hand. She'd never been the kind of woman who thought she needed saving. And she hadn't been saved. She'd saved herself. But she'd been seen. That somehow mattered more. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You think folks will ever stop whispering?" He kissed her hair, slow and sure. "They'll whisper something else tomorrow. Let 'em." From inside came the soft creak of wood settling, the pop of a dying ember. The wind moved through the wheat like a lullaby. Dora Dufran turned to him, voice low. "It's strange. I used to dream of this back when I was just a girl with calloused fingers and no place to go. But in my dreams, it was always someone else's ranch. Someone else's story." Elias shook his head. "This one's yours now. Ours if you want it that way." "I do." He smiled. "Then we'll build the rest of it together." She breathed in the scent of earth and smoke and sage. Everything smelled of home. Later that week, she began planting wildflowers along the fence. Bluebonnets, prairie stars, lavender always. Elias had asked her why and she'd said, "So the land remembers something beautiful happened here." He had nodded and left her to it. It would take time for the town to forget what Dora Dufran may used to be, a woman passed over, left behind. But she no longer cared what they called her. She was no longer running from the station. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen him. And he had chosen her. At the very end of spring, Dora Dufran sat at the window as a new rain whispered down, softer than any storm before. Elias slept in the chair nearby, boots off, book in his lap. The fire had burned low. She looked out over the land, the hills, the barn, the fields they'd soon harvest. Everything quiet. Everything right. She reached for the journal he'd left beside her and opened to the last page. In his heavy, uneven hand he'd written. She wasn't too old. She wasn't too late. She was just on time. For the life we hadn't dared to dream. Dora Dufran closed the book and smiled. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but it no longer mattered. This was her forever. And it had found her, not in a fairy tale, not in a dream, but in the dust of a train station, in the shadow of a storm, and in the arms of a man who loved quietly, like the land itself.